You know what is hotter than a Scottsdale summer? The boiling, white-hot rage you feel when a man wearing khaki shorts and a polo shirt tucked so high into his armpits it practically chokes him, hands you a $250 fine for a piece of cardboard. It was a Tuesday. I remember this specifically because Tuesdays in my neighborhood are garbage days, and garbage days in the sun-baked, hyper-manicured suburban utopia of the Desert Willow Homeowners Association are treated with the kind of strict, militaristic precision usually reserved for nuclear submarine deployments. I had lived in Desert Willow for exactly 8 months. I bought the house because it had a nice pool, a decent yard, and I figured a little desert solitude would be good for my remote work schedule. I did not buy the house to become a serf in a feudal society ruled by a retired middle manager named Richard. Richard was the president of the Desert Willow HOA Board. He drove a customized electric golf cart that he had outfitted with a flashing amber light on the roof, which he would switch on whenever he was on patrol. He had the posture of a man who had swallowed a yardstick in his youth and never fully digested it, and his entire existence seemed to revolve around ensuring that no blade of Bermuda grass ever dared to grow a millimeter taller than regulation height. That Tuesday morning, the Arizona sun was already beating down on the asphalt like a hammer on an anvil. It was barely 6:15 a.m., and the temperature was already pushing 90 degrees. I was standing in my driveway in athletic shorts and a t-shirt I had slept in, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, squinting against the glare. I was standing there because parked horizontally across the bottom of my driveway, blocking my car, was Richard's golf cart. The amber light was flashing. Richard stepped out of the cart. He was holding a clipboard. Not just any clipboard, but one of those heavy-duty aluminum contractor clipboards that opens up to store documents inside. He clicked his pen, a heavy metallic click that sounded like a pistol being cocked in the quiet morning air. "Morning, Richard," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee, trying to keep my voice aggressively neutral. Richard did not say good morning. He did not look at my face. He was looking at my garbage cans, which were sitting neatly by the curb. Then, his eyes slowly tracked over to the corner of my driveway, right near the impeccably trimmed oleander bushes. "Section 3, Article 4, Paragraph B of the Community Guidelines," Richard recited, his voice a nasal, authoritative drone. "Trash receptacles shall not be placed upon the curb prior to 6:00 a.m. on the designated day of collection." I blinked. I looked down at my watch. It was 6:16 a.m. "Richard, it's after 6. "I have dashcam footage from my patrol vehicle," Richard said, tapping the front of his golf cart with his pen, "showing these receptacles being placed on the public thoroughfare at precisely 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes early." I stared at him. I literally could not comprehend if this was a joke. "You're writing me up for putting my trash out 2 minutes early? 2 minutes? Are you serious right now?" "Rules are what separate us from the animals," Richard said smoothly, not missing a beat. He scribbled something on a pink slip of paper. "But that is merely a warning, a minor infraction. The real issue is the uncontained debris." "Uncontained debris?" I echoed, my voice rising an octave despite my best efforts to stay calm. "What uncontained debris?" Richard raised his pen and pointed toward the oleander bushes. I followed his gaze. There, resting innocuously against the stucco wall of my planter, was a single, medium-sized, flattened Amazon box. The shipping label was partially torn off. It wasn't even my box. It had blown over from somewhere down the street during the night winds. "That," Richard said, "is a blatant violation of Section 5, Article 2. Any unsanctioned item left outside your physical dwelling is classified as uncontained debris. It creates an eyesore. It invites pests. It lowers property values. "Richard, that's not even my box," I said, gesturing wildly with my free hand. "The wind blew it there. I was just about to pick it up and throw it in the recycling bin." "Irrelevant," Richard snapped. He pulled the pink slip from his clipboard with a sharp, tearing sound. "The debris is on your property lines. Therefore, you are the responsible party. The fine is $250, payable to the Desert Willow HOA within 14 business days. Failure to pay will result in a lien placed against your property." He marched forward and aggressively thrust the pink slip toward my chest. I didn't take it. I just let it flutter to the hot concrete between us. "$250 for a piece of stray cardboard?" I asked, my blood pressure completely overriding the caffeine. "You have got to be out of your mind. I'm not paying that." Richard smiled. It was a thin, cold, terrifyingly smug smile. It was the smile of a man who held all the cards and knew it. He reached into the aluminum compartment of his clipboard and pulled out a thick, spiral-bound booklet with a glossy cover. It was the Desert Willow Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. The CC and Rs. He had his personal copy laminated. "I strongly suggest you consult the governing documents you signed when you purchased this property," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You agreed to these terms. Any unsanctioned item left outside your physical dwelling is classified as uncontained debris. Clean it up, or the fines double tomorrow. Have a pleasant day." He turned on his heel, climbed into his golf cart, and drove away at exactly 4 miles per hour, the amber light flashing rhythmically against the morning sun. I stood there in the driveway for a long time. I looked at the pink slip on the ground. I looked at the Amazon box. I looked at my house. I felt a very distinct, very dangerous kind of clarity wash over me. Richard had just declared war over a piece of corrugated cardboard. He wanted to play by the book? Fine. We were going to play by the book. I bent down, picked up the pink slip, picked up the cardboard box, and walked inside. The air conditioning hit me like a wall of ice. I walked straight to the kitchen, bypassed the coffee maker entirely, and opened the liquor cabinet. It was 6:30 in the morning, but time is a construct when you are dealing with neighborhood tyranny. I poured 2 fingers of cheap bourbon into a glass, didn't bother with ice, and carried it to my home office. I booted up my computer and logged into the Desert Willow Community Portal. I downloaded the complete, unabridged, 142-page PDF of the CC and RS. If Richard was going to use this document as a weapon to extort $250 out of me, I needed to know every single word of it. I needed to know the armor, the weak points, the contradictions, and the loopholes. I spent the next 6 hours reading. I ignored my emails. I ignored my Slack messages. I read through regulations about the exact Pantone color codes permitted for exterior trim. I read through the acceptable dimensions of holiday wreaths. I read through the agonizingly specific definitions of what constituted a commercial vehicle. By noon, my eyes were burning, and the bourbon was long gone. The HOA manual was an impenetrable fortress of suburban control. It was designed to ensure that the HOA board had ultimate, unquestionable authority over every square inch of visible property. But then, around page 87, under the subheading Waste Management and Deliveries, I hit a snag. I read it once. I rubbed my eyes. I read it again. There it was. The crack in the armor. Clause 4.12 was the one Richard loved. It stated in bold, aggressive font, "Trash, refuse, and uncontained debris must be completely hidden from street view at all times, barring the designated collection window. But just 2 pages later, buried beneath a dense paragraph about mailbox post materials, was Clause 5.03. It read, "Residents may maintain secure parcel delivery receptacles at the curb or driveway edge to prevent theft of mail, provided said receptacles strictly adhere to United States Postal Service USPS guidelines and local municipal zoning laws." I leaned back in my desk chair, staring at the screen. The gears in my head were spinning so fast they were practically smoking. Richard had fined me because the cardboard box was unsanctioned. He considered it trash. But what if it wasn't trash? What if it was mail? And more importantly, if I was allowed to build a secure parcel delivery receptacle, as long as it met city and federal guidelines, what exactly did the city of Scottsdale consider a legal receptacle? I opened a new tab and pulled up the Scottsdale Municipal Building Codes. I searched for residential mailbox and parcel. Locker regulations. According to the city ordinances, a resident could construct a curbside structure up to 48 inches in height and 36 inches in width, provided it did not impede the public right-of-way or block utility access. The materials were not restricted by the city, only the dimensions. And according to the law, municipal codes superseded HOA aesthetic guidelines. If the city said it was a legal structure for the purpose of receiving mail, the HOA could not force me to tear it down without suing the city itself. A slow, wicked smile spread across my face. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used since I renovated my kitchen. "Yeah, Mike speaking," a gruff voice barked on the other end. Mike was a local independent contractor. He was a mountain of a man with hands like cinder blocks and a beard that looked like it contained a family of small birds. He was loud, he was fast, and he had absolutely zero patience for bureaucracy. He was exactly the man I needed. "Mike, hey, it's me. I have a project for you, and I need it done as quickly and as loudly as legally possible." "I like the sound of that," Mike grunted. "What are we building?" "I need you to build me a secure parcel delivery receptacle at the end of my driveway," I said, trying to keep the giddy excitement out of my voice. "A mailbox?" Mike asked, sounding profoundly disappointed. "You called me to put up a mailbox? Go to Home Depot, buy a post, and dig a hole, kid." "Not a mailbox, Mike. A secure parcel delivery receptacle. I want it to be 48 inches high, 36 inches wide. And I want it made entirely out of solid, reinforced, poured concrete. I want a heavy steel vault door on the front of it. I want a brutalist concrete monolith at the end of my driveway. Think Soviet-era bunker meets bank vault." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Mike breathing. "You want a 4-foot-tall block of solid concrete on your curb?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because my HOA president fined me $250 for a piece of cardboard, and the bylaws say I'm allowed to have a parcel locker as long as it meets city codes." Mike let out a low, rumbling laugh that sounded like a diesel engine turning over. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Have the coffee ready." Mike pulled up to my house 30 minutes later in a heavy-duty pickup truck covered in white dust. He stepped out, hitched up his jeans, and walked over to the edge of my driveway where I was waiting. He looked at the curb, looked at my house, and then looked down the street. "So, where's the dictator live?" Mike asked, pulling a tape measure off his belt. I pointed across the street and 3 houses down to Richard's impeccably maintained, aggressively beige house. "Right there, the one with the golf cart." "Perfect," Mike said. He knelt down and started snapping a chalk line on the concrete edge of my driveway. "We're going to build this right here. Maximum legal dimensions. 48 by 36. We're going to dig down a foot, lay rebar into the existing driveway so this thing is structurally integrated. If they want to move it, they're going to need a bulldozer and a jackhammer. Do we need permits for this? I asked, suddenly nervous that Richard could shut us down before we even started. Technically, for a masonry structure this small, no, Mike said, standing up and dusting off his knees. But because I know exactly what game we're playing here, I'm going to pull a minor encroachment permit from the city anyway. It costs $50, and it means the city of Scottsdale has officially blessed this concrete monstrosity. When old Dick over there comes over to complain, you just wave the stamped city paper in his face. Mike, you're an artist. I'm a guy who hates HOAs, Mike corrected. I'll have my crew here tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. sharp. We're going to bring a concrete mixer. It's going to be very loud. We're going to use heavy machinery. It's going to be very dusty. I expect nothing less. The next morning, at exactly 7 a.m., my quiet, serene suburban street was violently awakened by the roaring, grinding, mechanical scream of a diesel-powered concrete mixer backing into my driveway. The backup alarm, beep, 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 echoed off the stucco houses like a siren. Mike and two other massive guys jumped out, yelling instructions to each other over the noise. They immediately fired up an industrial concrete saw to cut into the edge of my driveway to lay the rebar foundation. The sound was deafening. A massive plume of white silica dust rose into the clear morning air. I stood on my porch, drinking my coffee, watching the chaos unfold with deep, profound satisfaction. It took exactly 14 minutes for the flashing amber light to appear. Richard's golf cart came hurtling down the street at its maximum speed of 12 miles per hour. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the pavement, and leapt out of the cart before it had even fully stopped. His face was a violent shade of magenta. He marched through the cloud of concrete dust, coughing and waving his hands, marching straight toward Mike. "Cease and desist!" Richard was screaming over the sound of the saw. "Shut that machine off immediately! You are in violation of neighborhood noise ordinances and unapproved structural modification bylaws." Mike didn't even look up. He kept bearing down on the concrete saw, sending a spray of sparks and dust directly toward Richard's shins. Richard jumped back, furiously brushing off his khaki shorts. "Hey!" Richard yelled, turning his fury toward me on the porch. "Tell your laborers to shut this down right now. You did not submit an architectural review form. This construction is illegal." I calmly walked down the steps of my porch and strolled over to the edge of the driveway, stopping just outside the dust cloud. "Morning, Richard. Beautiful day for some home improvement, isn't it?" "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "You are pouring concrete on the property line. You cannot build a wall without board approval. I am fining you $500 for unapproved construction, and I am calling the police to have these men trespassed." "It's not a wall, Richard," I said smoothly. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the minor encroachment permit Mike had secured from the city, complete with the official blue stamp of the Scottsdale Municipal Planning Office. It's a secure parcel delivery receptacle. Clause 5.03 of the CC&Rs states I am allowed to construct one, provided it meets USPS and city guidelines. As you can see by this permit, the city of Scottsdale has fully approved the construction of a 48-inch masonry structure on this exact spot. I held the paper out. Richard snatched it from my hand. His eyes darted wildly over the document, reading the city stamp, the dimensions, the approval signature. I could see the muscles in his jaw clenching so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. This is a loophole," Richard sputtered. "A mailbox does not need to be a poured concrete bunker." "The CC&Rs do not specify aesthetic materials for parcel receptacles, Richard," I replied, maintaining relentless eye contact. They only defer to city code. And the city code says I can build it out of reinforced concrete. So that is what I am doing. I have a lot of very important packages delivered. I need them to be secure. This is an eyesore, Richard yelled. It violates the spirit of the community guidelines. I'm sorry, Richard, but I prefer to go by the letter of the law, not the spirit. Isn't that what you told me yesterday? Rules are what separate us from the animals? Richard stood there, vibrating with impotent fury. He looked at the permit, looked at the massive wooden forms Mike's crew was building to hold the concrete, and looked at me. He knew he was beaten on the construction. The permit was ironclad. If he called the police, they would look at the city permit and tell him it was a civil matter. This isn't over, Richard hissed, shoving the permit back into my chest. When that monstrosity is finished, if it doesn't meet exact postal regulations, I will personally hire a crew to smash it to rubble and bill you for the demolition. He stormed back to his golf cart, peeling away in a huff of electric whining. Mike shut off the saw. The sudden silence was ringing in my ears. He pushed his safety glasses up onto his forehead and grinned at me. I think he likes it. He's going to hate it, I said. Keep pouring, Mike. Make it thick. The construction took 2 full days. When they pulled the wooden forms away on Thursday afternoon, what stood at the end of my driveway was nothing short of a brutalist masterpiece. It was a solid, pale gray block of unpainted, unapologetic concrete. It was exactly 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide. On the front, Mike had bolted a heavy, black steel locking vault door, the kind they use for commercial drop boxes. It looked like it could survive a direct mortar strike. In a neighborhood of delicate beige stucco, terracotta roof tiles, and manicured rose bushes, my parcel locker looked like a monument to industrial warfare. It was hideous. It was magnificent. I paid Mike in cash, shook his hand, and spent the rest of Thursday evening sitting on my porch with a cold beer, watching my neighbors drive by. Every single car slowed down. I saw people pointing. I saw confused expressions. I saw Richard drive by 3 times in his golf cart, glaring at the monolith with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. But building the bunker was only phase 1. The bunker was just the stage. Now I needed to execute the actual revenge. Richard had fined me for having cardboard outside. He had called it uncontained debris. He had used his power to try and bully me into submission. It was time to give Richard exactly what he wanted. It was time to deal with my debris. I walked back into my house and went straight to the garage. Over the last 2 days, while Mike was building the vault, I had been busy. I had been saving every single piece of dry, non-hazardous trash I could find. Junk mail, empty cereal boxes, paper towel tubes, crushed La Croix cans, shredded bank statements. I had accumulated 3 large, heavy-duty moving boxes full of absolute garbage. According to Richard and Section 5, Article 2, this was all unsanctioned debris. And according to Richard, leaving it on my property was a violation. I couldn't throw it in my trash can because my trash can was full, and if the lid didn't close completely, that was another $50 fine under Section 3, Article 4. I couldn't leave it in my house because I didn't want garbage in my house. I needed to dispose of it. But I couldn't just throw it away. I needed to deliver it. I loaded the 3 heavy boxes of trash into the trunk of my car and drove to the nearest Target. I walked into the party supplies aisle and spent $30 on the most obnoxiously cheerful, retina-burning, glittery birthday wrapping paper I could find. It had holographic unicorns and rainbows on it. I also bought 3 massive, bright pink silk ribbons. I drove home, hauled the boxes into my living room, and spent the next hour meticulously gift-wrapping my garbage. I made sure the corners were perfectly creased. I tied the pink ribbons into elaborate, flawless bows. They looked like massive, extravagant presents fit for a sweet 16 party. Then, I loaded the beautifully wrapped boxes back into my car and drove to the United States Post Office. I carried the 3 massive, glittering packages into the lobby and hauled them onto the counter. The postal worker behind the glass, a tired-looking woman named Brenda, blinked at the holographic unicorns. "Sending a gift?" Brenda asked, suppressing a smile. "Oh, you have no idea," I replied, leaning against the counter. "It's for a very special neighbor." "Where are these going?" she asked, typing on her terminal. "Right across the street from my house," I said. I handed her a piece of paper with Richard's exact address. "But I need these shipped very specifically. I need them sent certified mail, and I need a return receipt requested, with a physical signature." Brenda stopped typing. She looked at the boxes, then looked up at me. She had been working at the post office long enough to know what certified mail with a return receipt meant. It meant I was creating a legal paper trail. It meant the person receiving the package had to physically sign a green postcard proving they took possession of the item. "You're paying postage to mail 3 giant boxes across the street, and you want the recipient forced to sign for them?" Brenda asked, raising an eyebrow. "Exactly," I said. "By paying for postage and applying a shipping label, these boxes legally cease to be my personal property, correct? They become United States mail, parcel freight." Brenda nodded slowly. "Once I scan them in and put the postage on, they are federal property until they are delivered and signed for, yes." "Perfect. Ring it up." Brenda weighed the boxes. Because they were filled with compacted cardboard and junk mail, they were actually quite heavy. The total postage, including the certified mail fees and the return receipts, came out to $42.50. I handed over my credit card with a massive grin. Brenda slapped the tracking barcodes onto the holographic unicorns. She handed me my receipt. "They'll be out for delivery tomorrow morning," Brenda said, handing me my card back. "Whatever is in those boxes, I hope they like it." "Oh, he is going to absolutely lose his mind," I promised her. I drove home feeling lighter than air. The trap was set. The legal mechanism was engaged. I had taken Richard's definition of uncontained debris, completely bypassed his HOA authority, and utilized the federal infrastructure of the United States government to make it his problem. Friday morning arrived. The tension in my house was palpable. I didn't even pretend to work. I pulled an armchair right up to the front window of my living room, cracked the blinds, and sat there with a pair of binoculars I had dug out of my closet. I was watching Richard's house like a hawk. At 10:15 a.m., the familiar white mail truck turned the corner onto our street. My heart rate spiked. This was it. The truck slowly made its way down the street, stopping at the curbside mailboxes. When it reached my house, the mail carrier didn't even pause at my new brutalist concrete vault. He didn't have anything for me. He drove straight past it and pulled up to Richard's driveway. Through the binoculars, I watched the mail carrier put his vehicle in park. He got out, walked around to the back of the truck, and rolled up the door. He reached inside and pulled out the first box. The morning sun hit the holographic unicorn paper, sending a blinding glare of glittery light across the pristine beige neighborhood. The mail carrier stacked the 3 massive, glittering boxes on his hand truck, grabbed his digital scanner and a stack of green slips, and wheeled the absurd cargo up Richard's perfectly stamped concrete walkway to his front door. He rang the doorbell. I held my breath. A moment later, the front door opened. Richard stood there, wearing his khaki shorts and his tucked-in polo. Even from across the street, I could see the utter confusion wash over his face. He looked at the giant, glittering presents. He looked at the mail carrier. The mail carrier held out his scanner and the green slips. I knew exactly what he was saying. "Certified mail, sir. I need your signature for these 3 parcels." Richard hesitated. Who wouldn't? It looked like someone had sent him a lottery prize, but Richard's ego was too big to refuse a package. He probably assumed it was a gift from a grateful neighbor for keeping the community so safe and compliant. I watched through the binoculars as Richard took the stylus, signed his name on the digital pad, and then scribbled his signature on the 3 green return receipt cards. The mail carrier tore the green cards off, handed Richard his copy of the receipt, tipped his hat, and walked back to his truck. Richard was left standing on his porch with 3 massive boxes. He looked around the street, puffing his chest out a little bit, before dragging the boxes inside, one by one. The door clicked shut. I put the binoculars down. I looked at the clock on the wall. Tick-tock. It took exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Suddenly, Richard's front door blew open like it had been kicked from the inside. Richard came storming out onto his porch. His face wasn't magenta anymore. It was a terrifying, apoplectic shade of deep purple. In his hands, he was holding a torn piece of holographic unicorn paper, a crushed, empty box of Cheerios, and a handful of crumpled Bed Bath & Beyond coupons. He marched to the edge of his lawn, looked directly across the street at my house, and let out a scream of pure, unfiltered suburban rage. "You!" Richard roared, his voice echoing off the stucco walls. "You delinquent! You vandal!" I casually opened my front door and stepped out onto my porch. I leaned against the railing, holding my coffee mug. "Morning, Richard. Did you get my packages? The tracking app said they were just delivered." "You mailed me garbage!" Richard screamed, throwing the empty Cheerio box onto his own lawn. He began stomping across the street, not even bothering to use the crosswalk, his fists clenched at his sides. "You illegally dumped your uncontained debris into my home. This is a biological hazard. This is harassment. I am calling the police." Whoa, Richard, calm down," I said, putting a hand on my chest in mock offense as he reached the edge of my driveway. He was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead. "I didn't illegally dump anything. I utilized the United States Postal Service to dispatch a parcel. You received the parcel. You signed for it. I have the return receipt coming back to me to prove it." "It's trash," Richard spat, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You took your garbage, put it in a box, and sent it to me." "No, Richard," I corrected him, stepping down off my porch. "Yesterday, you told me that any unsanctioned item outside my dwelling was uncontained debris. So I contained it. I put it in a box. But I couldn't keep it here, because that would violate the CC&Rs. So I took it to the post office, and I paid $42 in federal postage to ship it. The moment the post office accepted it, it legally became U.S. mail. And the moment your pen hit that signature pad, you claimed legal ownership of said mail. That's not my garbage anymore, Richard. That's your property." Richard stared at me. His mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish out of water. He was trying to find a rule, a regulation, a bylaw to throw at me, but his brain was short-circuiting. The HOA manual did not cover the weaponization of the federal postal system. "You think you're clever," Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think you can play games with me? I am the president of this board. I control the fines. I control the liens. I am calling the police right now, and I am pressing charges for harassment and illegal dumping." He ripped his cell phone out of his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it on the grass. He snatched it up, dialed 911, and pressed the phone to his ear. "Yes, police?" Richard barked into the phone. "I need officers dispatched to Desert Willow immediately. I have a resident here who is harassing me, illegally dumping hazardous waste onto my property, and threatening me. Yes, send them now." He hung up the phone and glared at me with a look of absolute triumph. "They're on their way. You're going to jail, you smartass." "I'll make a fresh pot of coffee," I said cheerfully. "I think the officers might want some." I went back inside, made the coffee, and brought 2 extra mugs out to the porch. I sat in my rocking chair, waiting. Richard paced back and forth at the end of my driveway, pacing right next to my brutalist concrete mail vault, muttering to himself and furiously typing notes into his phone. 10 minutes later, a white Ford Explorer with the Scottsdale Police Department logo rolled down the street and parked behind Richard's golf cart. 2 officers got out. One was a tall, older guy who looked like he was 3 days away from retirement. The other was a younger, stockier guy who looked incredibly annoyed to be answering a call in a gated suburban community. Richard instantly rushed the officers, waving his arms. "Officers, thank God you're here!" Richard practically shouted. "This man," he pointed violently at me sitting on my porch, "is conducting a campaign of terror against me. He is dumping hazardous waste onto my property. He built an illegal concrete structure without permits. He is violating multiple municipal codes." The older officer held up a hand. "Okay, sir, let's take a breath. What kind of hazardous waste are we talking about here? Are there chemicals? Biologicals?" "It's his trash!" Richard yelled. "He boxed up his household garbage and dumped it in my living room." The officers looked at each other, their hands moving slightly closer to their duty belts. The older officer turned his attention to me. "Sir, can you step down here, please?" I took a sip of my coffee, stood up, and casually walked down the driveway to meet them. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you?" "This gentleman is claiming you dumped trash inside his house," the younger officer said, his tone flat and skeptical. "Care to explain?" "I absolutely did not enter his house, officer, nor did I dump anything on his property," I said calmly. I pulled a folded piece of paper out of my pocket. It was the receipt from the post office. What I did do was utilize the United States Postal Service to send a package via certified mail. Mr. Richard here is the president of our HOA. He has been issuing me fines for having empty cardboard boxes on my property, classifying them as uncontained debris. Since I am not allowed to have them, I boxed them up, paid federal postage, and mailed them to him as a gift. He signed for the packages approximately 20 minutes ago. Whatever he chose to do with the contents of his mail after he opened it inside his own home is entirely his business. I handed the older officer the USPS receipt. The officer looked at the receipt, looked at the tracking numbers, and then looked at Richard. "Sir," the older officer said, turning back to Richard, "did you receive a package in the mail this morning?" "It wasn't a package. It was a trap. It was full of junk mail and empty cereal boxes," Richard yelled. "But did it come through the mail? Did a mail carrier deliver it?" the officer pressed. "Yes, but that's not the point." "Actually, sir, that is entirely the point," the older officer said, sighing heavily. He handed my receipt back to me. "If this gentleman paid postage and sent an item through the U.S. mail, and you accepted delivery and signed for it, no laws were broken. It is not illegal to mail someone empty boxes or junk mail, provided it doesn't contain actual hazardous materials like explosives or biohazards. Dry cardboard and paper do not meet that criteria. "He's harassing me," Richard insisted, his voice cracking. "He's making a mockery of the community standards." "Sir, community standards are an HOA issue, not a police issue," the younger officer chimed in, crossing his arms. "We enforce the law. Sending a petty package through the mail isn't a crime. It's a civil dispute. If you don't like what he sends you, don't sign for the packages." "What about that?" Richard shrieked, suddenly pivoting and pointing a shaking finger at my concrete mail vault. "He built that illegal concrete bunker on the property line. It's an unpermitted structure. It's a hazard." I smiled. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the city permit. I unfolded it and handed it to the younger officer. "Actually, officer, that is a secure parcel delivery receptacle," I said smoothly, "constructed specifically to receive the mail. It is 48 inches high, 36 inches wide, and as you can see by that permit, it was fully approved and stamped by the City of Scottsdale Planning Department 2 days ago." The younger officer read the permit, checked the blue stamp, and looked at the concrete monolith. He bit his lower lip, clearly trying very hard not to laugh. He handed the permit back to me. "Looks like his paperwork is in order, sir," the younger officer said to Richard. "The structure is legally permitted by the city." Richard looked like he was going to have a stroke. His face was pale, his mouth was open, and he was staring at the officers with a look of utter betrayal. You're doing nothing? You're just going to let him get away with this?" "There is nothing to get away with, sir," the older officer said, his tone hardening, clearly losing patience. "No crime has been committed here. This is a neighbor dispute over HOA rules. I suggest you two work this out at your next board meeting. If you call 911 again because someone mailed you a box of paper, we will cite you for misuse of the emergency system. Do you understand me?" Richard didn't answer. He just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of his own defeat. "Have a good day, gentlemen," the older officer said. They turned around, got back into their Explorer, and drove away. I stood in my driveway, took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, and looked at Richard. He was staring at the ground. "You know, Richard," I said softly, "the CC&Rs say any unsanctioned item left outside your physical dwelling is classified as uncontained debris. You left that empty Cheerios box on your lawn when you came over here to yell at me. That's a violation of Section 5, Article 2. I'm going to have to document that and report it to the board." Richard slowly looked up at me. The fire in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by a hollow, defeated exhaustion. He turned around, walked slowly across the street, picked up his Cheerio box, walked into his house, and shut the door. I walked over to my beautiful, brutalist concrete vault, patted the heavy steel door, and smiled. The battle of the driveway was won, but the war was far from over. Richard was still the president of the HOA, and I knew he was going to try and weaponize the entire board against me at the next meeting. He was going to try and change the rules. But I was ready. I had the municipal code, I had the federal postal regulations, and I had a very detailed plan for the monthly Desert Willow HOA Board meeting on Tuesday night. I was going to turn his own rulebook into a public spectacle. The next few days were quietly agonizing. It was that specific, heavy kind of silence that settles over a battlefield right before the artillery starts firing again. Richard completely ghosted the neighborhood. His golf cart stayed securely parked in his garage. The amber light was off. He didn't do his morning patrols. He didn't cite Mrs. Gable for leaving her garden hose coiled improperly. He was, for all intents and purposes, barricaded inside his beige fortress, licking his wounds and plotting his revenge. I spent the weekend prepping. And I mean, I literally treated this like I was going to trial at the Supreme Court. I went to the local FedEx office store and printed out 50 full-color, high-quality packets. I spiral-bound them. Each packet contained the original pink slip fine, highlighted copies of the Desert Willow CC and Rs, the official city zoning ordinances, the stamped municipal encroachment permit for my concrete vault, and a full printout of the United States Postal Service regulations regarding certified mail and the legal transfer of property ownership. I even included a glossy 8x10 photograph of the brutalist concrete vault, just to really drive the point home. I spent maybe $80 on printing, but honestly, it was the best money I had ever spent in my entire life. Tuesday night rolled around. The Desert Willow HOA monthly board meeting was held at 7 p.m. in the community center, which was basically just a glorified, oversized living room next to the neighborhood pool. Usually, these meetings were attended by Richard, the 3 other board members, and maybe 1 or 2 retired folks who wanted to complain about the pool temperature. Not tonight. When I walked through the double-glass doors at 6:50 p.m., the room was absolutely packed. I'm talking standing room only. There had to be 60 or 70 people crammed into the folding chairs, leaning against the walls and whispering loudly to each other. The suburban grapevine is faster than fiber-optic internet. Everyone had heard about the guy who built a bank vault on his driveway to fight a trash fine. Everyone had heard about the police showing up at Richard's house. They were here for blood, and they were here for the show. I grabbed a styrofoam cup, poured myself some incredibly bitter, lukewarm community center coffee, and took a seat in the very back row. I had my box of 50 spiral-bound dossiers resting on my lap. At exactly 7 p.m., Richard walked to the front of the room. He looked terrible. The confident, smug posture of the golf cart dictator was completely gone. He looked sleep-deprived. His polo shirt was wrinkled. He took his seat at the center of the folding table at the front of the room, flanked by the other board members. Susan, a quiet woman who always looked like she was apologizing for something, and Dave, a guy who owned a local car dealership and exclusively looked at his phone during these meetings. Richard slammed a wooden gavel onto the table. It was excessively loud. "I call this meeting of the Desert Willow Homeowners Association to order," Richard announced, his voice tight and raspy. He glared out at the crowded room, his eyes scanning the faces until they locked onto mine in the back row. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "We will be skipping the reading of the previous minutes and the treasurer's report tonight. We have an urgent emergency matter regarding a severe breach of community standards, illegal construction, and coordinated harassment against a board member." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. People were literally leaning forward in their folding chairs. "I am proposing an immediate emergency injunction," Richard continued, speaking faster now, his face flushing red. "Against the resident at Lot 412. I am motioning for a $5,000 punitive fine for the unapproved, malicious construction of a masonry wall on the property line. Furthermore, I am motioning that the HOA authorize an external demolition crew to remove the structure by the end of the week, with all costs billed directly to the homeowner. And finally, I am seeking a formal cease and desist order regarding the sending of biological hazards and debris through the mail to my personal residence." The room erupted. People were gasping, whispering, turning around to look at me. A $5,000 fine was unprecedented. Demolishing someone's property was thermonuclear war. Susan leaned over to Richard and whispered something frantically, looking terrified. Dave finally put his phone down and stared at Richard like the man had just grown a second head. "Do I have a second on the motion?" Richard demanded, ignoring them both, gripping his gavel so hard his knuckles were white. Before Susan or Dave could even process the absolute insanity of what he was asking, I stood up. "Point of order, Mr. President," I called out. My voice was calm, clear, and projected across the room perfectly. Richard slammed the gavel again. "You do not have the floor. You are out of order." "Actually, Richard, according to Robert's Rules of Order, which Section 2, Article 1 of our bylaws explicitly states we follow for all board meetings, a resident who is the subject of a punitive motion has the right to address the board before a vote is seconded," I said, reciting the rule I had memorized over the weekend. "So technically I do have the floor, unless you want to violate the CC&Rs in front of 60 witnesses?" Richard's mouth snapped shut. He looked at Susan, who quickly opened her laptop, checked the bylaws, and nodded nervously. Richard looked like he wanted to swallow a live grenade. "You have 3 minutes," Richard spat. "I won't even need that long," I said cheerfully. I picked up my box of dossiers and walked down the center aisle. I handed a stack to the first person in the front row. "Pass these back, please." I handed another stack to the other side. "Make sure everyone gets a copy." Then I walked right up to the folding table and gently placed 3 dossiers in front of Richard, Susan, and Dave. "What is this?" Dave asked, looking at the glossy cover photo of my concrete vault. "That, Dave, is a comprehensive legal defense against a man who is currently trying to use HOA funds to fund a personal vendetta," I said, turning to face the crowd. "Let's review the facts, shall we? If you all turn to page 1 of your packets, you will see a citation issued to me last Tuesday by Richard. The fine was $250. The infraction? An empty, flattened Amazon box that blew onto my property from the street. Richard classified this as uncontained debris." I paused, letting the absurdity of it hang in the air. I heard a few people in the crowd scoff. Someone in the back muttered, "$250 for a box? Are you kidding me?" "Now," I continued, pacing slowly in front of the table, "Richard told me that any unsanctioned item outside my dwelling was illegal. So I consulted our governing documents. Turn to page 3, please. Clause 5.03. I have highlighted it for you. It states that residents may maintain a secure parcel delivery receptacle, provided it meets city and postal guidelines." I gestured to the glossy photo on the cover of the packet. "So I built one. Richard is calling it an unapproved masonry wall. However, if you turn to page 5, you will see a fully approved, legally stamped minor encroachment permit from the City of Scottsdale Municipal Planning Office. The city legally defines my structure as a parcel delivery receptacle. It is 48 inches high. It is 36 inches wide. It is legally untouchable by this HOA unless you intend to sue the City of Scottsdale. And I really don't think we have the budget for that, do we, Dave?" Dave, the treasurer, aggressively shook his head. "Absolutely not." Richard slammed his fist on the table. "It's an eyesore. It's a spite fence disguised as a mailbox. And that doesn't excuse the fact that you mailed me your garbage." "Ah, yes, the garbage," I said, turning back to the crowd, smiling broadly. "Let's talk about the biological hazard Richard claims I sent him. Turn to page 7, everyone." The sound of 60 people turning pages simultaneously was like music to my ears. Because Richard insisted that the cardboard box was uncontained debris, I realized I needed to contain it, I explained, my tone conversational and breezy. But I couldn't throw it in my trash can because my trash can was full. So I boxed it up. But I couldn't leave the boxes in my house, so I took them to the United States Post Office. I paid $42 in federal postage, and I mailed them to Richard via certified mail. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. People were staring at me like I was a mad scientist explaining how I split the atom. "Now, let's look at page 8, I said, pointing to the printed federal regulations. Under federal law, the moment the post office accepts a package, it ceases to be the property of the sender. It becomes U.S. mail. And the moment the recipient signs the certified return receipt, which Richard did willingly on his own front porch, they claim legal ownership of that parcel. Therefore, I did not dump garbage on Richard's property. The United States government delivered Richard's legally owned parcel freight to his door. If he considers the contents of his own mail to be a biological hazard, that is a personal issue, not an HOA issue." I turned back to the table and leaned in close to Richard. He was shaking, actually vibrating with rage. "So, to summarize," I said, my voice dropping an octave, completely losing the breezy tone. "Richard wants to fine me $5,000 and illegally demolish a city-approved structure because he got outplayed by his own rulebook. He wasted police resources by calling 911 because he didn't like the mail he signed for. And now he wants you, the board, and you, the residents, to back him up on this absolute circus of a power trip." I stood up straight and addressed the room. I moved to dismiss the initial $250 fine with prejudice. I moved to strike Richard's $5,000 punitive motion from the record. And honestly, I move that we seriously reconsider who we have running this community. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then a guy in the 3rd row started clapping. Slowly at first, just a loud rhythmic smack of his hands. Then the woman next to him joined in. Then the guy in the back row. Within 10 seconds, the entire community center erupted into a deafening roar of applause and cheering. People were whistling. Someone yelled, "Down with the golf cart!" It was absolute, unadulterated chaos. Susan, the secretary, grabbed the microphone on the table. She looked at the cheering crowd, looked at the undeniable, legally bulletproof packet of evidence in front of her, and then looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Motion to dismiss all fines and penalties against Lot 412, Susan said into the microphone, her voice surprisingly steady. "Seconded," Dave yelled immediately, not even looking up from the packet. "Hell, I'll third it if I have to." Richard sat frozen in his chair. The gavel slipped out of his hand and rolled off the table, clattering onto the linoleum floor. The applause washed over him, a physical wave of rejection from the very people he had spent the last 5 years trying to control. His face wasn't red anymore. It was completely pale, drained of all the arrogant blood that had fueled his little suburban dictatorship. He didn't say a word. He didn't try to argue. He didn't invoke Robert's rules of order. He just slowly pushed his chair back, stood up, and walked out the side door of the community center, disappearing into the warm Arizona night. The meeting descended into a disorganized celebration after that. Dave officially stamped my record clean, dissolving the fines. At least 20 different neighbors came up to shake my hand, asking for the name of the contractor who built my vault, just in case they ever needed to make a point of their own. I handed out Mike's business card to everyone who asked. The aftermath of the Great Garbage War was surprisingly swift and completely glorious. Less than 48 hours after the board meeting, an email went out to the entire Desert Willow community portal. It was a brief, highly sanitized message from Susan, stating that Richard had stepped down from his position as HOA president, effective immediately, citing personal health reasons and a desire to spend more time with his family. Nobody bought it, of course. Everyone knew he had been publicly humiliated into exile, By the end of the week, the flashing amber light had been removed from the roof of his golf cart. I saw him driving it down the street exactly once after that, just going to the community mailbox. He drove exactly the speed limit. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. And when he drove past my house, he actively turned his head the other way to avoid looking at the 4-foot-tall block of solid, unapologetic concrete sitting on my property line. Susan was elected as the interim president the following month. Her first act in office was to propose an amendment to the CC&Rs, completely stripping the aggressive, uncontained debris clauses and severely limiting the board's power to issue immediate fines without a written warning and a mandatory grace period. The neighborhood voted it through unanimously. As for me, I kept the vault. Honestly, it started to grow on me. It was weirdly functional. My Amazon packages were never stolen. The mail carrier thought it was the funniest thing he had ever seen and actually started leaving little dog treats on top of it for the neighborhood strays. And every time I walked out to my driveway with my morning coffee to grab the mail, I would look at that heavy steel door, and I would smile. It wasn't just a secure parcel delivery receptacle. It was a monument. It was a permanent, physical reminder that no matter how many clipboards they carry, no matter how many laminated rulebooks they wave in your face, the petty tyrants of the world can always be beaten. You don't have to break the rules to win. You just have to read them better than they do. You just have to find the loophole, dig your heels in, and pour the concrete. And that, my friends, is why you always read the fine print. Until next time, keep your property lines tight and your malicious compliance tighter.